Life brings an ongoing series of goodbyes, small and large. Every change of job and residence, the completion of a course or an academic level in school, each loss or change in a relationship connection, family, friends, work colleagues, church associates, and those significant and inevitable life transitions, serious illness, marriage, parenthood, divorce, retirement, death, make their own unique demands for integration and emotional acceptance. Every goodbye is an opportunity to practice grieving skills. The vast majority of us, however, have little appreciation of this offering, much less the importance of such practice. Indeed, with the exception of divorce and death, we are often unaware of the need for grieving. So it is no wonder that when the major goodbyes, like divorce and death, come along, we are not only overwhelmed by our feelings, we are overwhelmed by the task of mourning. This is true whether it is our loss or we are witness to another's pain in their loss. In fact, unless we process our own grief, we generally cannot fully be there for someone else because their pain triggers our unresolved issues. In her book, Necessary Losses, Judith Forst asserts that loss is central to and pervasive in everyone's life. She divides our losses into four major categories. First, the losses of childhood and the becoming of a separate self. Second, the losses of accepting the limitations of our power and potential, including the forbidden and the impossible. Third, the losses of our dreams of ideal relationships to the reality of imperfect human connections. And fourth, the losses of people we love to death. You have just heard the opening paragraphs of a term paper I wrote 5 years ago for a graduate class at Unity Institute and Seminary. I'm really proud of it. Yeah. The research and writing of that paper was the start of my framing personal experiences of loss and change as a healing journey of my own and something that called me to share it with others. I am passionate about the subject of change and loss, grief and bereavement. And it's a weird thing to be passionate about. You know, there's joy in it, and there's also this seriousness. And most of us don't know how to deal with our emotions about loss, often because we haven't seen others do so well. We don't know how to do good grief. So we suppress our feelings. And it's not a conscious choice, it's reflexive. As an unfortunate result, we live tamped down lives because when we narrow one end of our feelings on the spectrum of emotions, inevitably the other one gets tamped down too. Because suppressing any emotion takes so much of our energy that we have to carefully use whatever's left. Holding on to anything too tightly squeezes the life out of it. When we allow our emotions to move through us, we automatically feel them and release them. And this is as true for sadness and grief as it is for any other emotion. So my purpose in having this ministry, in paying attention to it, is so that we can live more fully. It's something that I remember and then I forget. And I'm so glad that I'm giving this talk today because lately I've been feeling a lot of sadness and forgetting that there's joy there too. And that there's openings and changes. I remembered it when I moved here back in July. I remembered that there was great joy in having changes, but somehow over the past several months, enough things have happened that I haven't done very well that I forgot. And so, if you ever need to remember something, ask Catherine if you can give a Sunday talk. So, grief isn't only something that accompanies death and divorce and other life changes, major life changes. It's with us in small ways every day. The changing of the seasons, having to throw away a favorite piece of clothing because it is finally worn out and there is no way that you can actually get any more life out of it. The start of a new work schedule, retirement, a child, even a grown child, moving so far away. These are big changes and little changes too. And they all bring their own emotional charges, whether we examine and embrace them or not. So my personal history about loss has the same kinds of things in it that yours does. The loss of a parent to death unexpectedly. And as big as that was, 2 cats dying within 11 months in very different ways, one very quickly, one very slowly. Those were such big events in my life. And I grieved them, I think, more than some of the others. For after all, those cats and I shared our everyday lives. I still miss Miss M and Barkley, even though I have another cat who is as crazy as they come. The very first loss that I am aware of, that I really grieved, and grieved for a very long time, is a story that many of my friends have heard so often that they don't want to hear it again. And it's the story of being 9 years old and being told that the family was moving from Milwaukee, where I had all my family, all my friends, great extended family, to Washington, D.C. And my mother told me that I would like that because that was part of the South, Virginia, and they said yes, sir, and no, ma'am. Now, I ask you, what 9-year-old wants to hear that that's a good reason to want to move somewhere? I still shake my head over my mom, and for many years I was very upset with her because my mom didn't grieve well. My mom was one of those people who really was shut off about that. And so the way that family system works, I did the grieving for the family, and I grieved like only a 9 or 10-year-old can grieve for like 2 years, and I really tried to make everyone around me as miserable as I was, and I did not succeed. I finally figured out that that was not the way to be in a new place and moved into it. But you can see that I have this really awkward history of grieving. So I had to learn how to do it well. In general, our society doesn't deal well with sad feelings and with emotional pain. Often we hold public self-restraint and stoicism in high regard. Is there anybody besides me who remembers how the media extolled Jackie Kennedy for the way that she was so restrained and so ladylike in her grief over the assassination of JFK? And it's interesting to me this past week, even though I don't particularly agree with Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia's rulings and his particular bent about the law, but it's interesting to me that very quickly his death moved from grieving a man to political infighting about what's going to happen to his position on the Supreme Court. I think that that says something about our society that I actually don't like. And it's really intriguing to me. So there are all kinds of cultural, and social and psychological factors that contribute to our awkwardness with grief and bereavement. I think that one of them about death is that in years past, and I'm talking 50 years ago, 100 years ago, death was more frequent, certainly, and less removed than it is today. I mean, infants and children in earlier generations had often very personal experience with the death of siblings and parents. I mean, when I think about that, it's amazing to me. And it's one of the things that I think has happened when death occurred. It was often in the family home. That's not the case today. And it wasn't something that people were so shielded from and walked away from. It was part of everyday life in a way that I think it isn't for us today. We go to drastic measures to keep people alive. And I sometimes wonder about the quality of our lives when we're doing that for others. Grief counselor Dr. Ellen Wolfort believes that our fast-paced culture, our accompanying sense of disconnection, and social valuing of self-reliance all contribute to our general uneasiness with grief. He tells us grief isn't fast. I think we all have had an experience of grieving and expecting to be over it much sooner than when you look back at it makes any sense at all. Our daily lives tell us that rugged individualism and mourning don't mix very well. And as another barrier to grief, I think that many members of the medical establishment seem to view grief as an illness or a malady to treat rather than the normal emotional distress associated with a loss. Well-meaning family doctors and professionals routinely prescribe anti-anxiety medication to alleviate the pain of grieving widows and widowers and children, rather than listening to and helping family members in their mourning. One of the things that really helped me the most when my mom died very quickly and unexpectedly, 15 years ago now almost, was having a grief professional in the hospice community say to me, "Tell me your story." And she listened and listened and listened, and then she said, I know that this is an important story for you. Losing someone, it's always an important story. She said, share that story with as many people who will listen. And that part of it really helped me to deal with it, to come to terms with it. One of the things that I think also has sort of hamstrung us is that in 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published a book called On Death and Dying. And this book has been misunderstood for decades upon decades. In it, she reported on her observations and her graduate students' observations in talking with the dying and their family members. And she lamented the general poor and thoughtless treatment of terminal patients and their families. But mostly it was the terminal patients. The work was not a research study. It was experiential reporting that paved the way for a more humane and informed care for the dying patient. She really paved the way for hospice here in America. The publication of that book led to the general dissemination and public acceptance of what we now refer to as the 5 stages of grief. Kubler-Ross originally called them the 5 stages of dying. It was in the dying's individual experience, the person who was meeting death, not the people who were left behind. And these 5 stages, we all know them. Sometimes we know them by their acronym, DABDA. denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we've come to believe that we move through these stages. We might move back and forth, but that somebody always has to hit every single one of them. There's newer research, a 2009 book by a researcher called George A. Bonanno, The Other Side of Sadness, What the New Science of Bereavement Tells Us About Life After Loss. And he examined the evidence for the validity of this 5-stage model and discovered that there wasn't any, which I found amazing. His own research reporting about this begins with telling us about the human capacity for resilience. And it demonstrates that most of us possess this quality of resilience. There are other books that teach us how to build this quality of resilience, and that we use this trait in our everyday lives and certainly in the aftermath of any tragedy. And Bonanno's findings are a spark of light for me. They're more than a spark of light, they're a spotlight, because he shows that we regularly enjoy brief moments of happiness and joy, even in the earliest days of our bereavement and loss. Now, sometimes, maybe you, like I, experience that and think, oh no, I shouldn't be feeling that. Guess what happens when we tell ourselves that? We use energy to suppress it. That narrows the capacity for joy. It narrows our capacity to feel loss. There we are, sort of stuck in this gooey mess of spending energy suppressing emotions that are absolutely normal and natural. Who amongst us hasn't, at a funeral of someone that we really care about, or a memorial service, or even in the hospital, maybe, as somebody lies dying, think about a funny story and tell it, and then say, oh, we shouldn't be laughing? You know, it's so interesting. We humans put so many rules and regulations around ourselves. Bonanno uses a wonderful term that I love to describe this. He talks about the fact that grief, like our other bodily processes, fluctuates in an oscillatory pattern in our lives. Electrical engineers know oscillatory. And the rest of us do too. It's breathing in and out. It's the heart pumping and then stopping and then beating and then stopping. It's all of our bodily functions. It's a back and forth, an ebb and a flow. Grief is like that too. So while George Bonanno does not discount those who experience deep despair following the death of a loved one, he does report that many of us move back into our normal lives without significant impairment within 6 months of our loss. Now, I don't know about you, but I had always heard that, it was 2 years. And so any significant loss that I had ever experienced before I read this book, I gave the full 2 years to it. Sort of like it was some sacrificial something in order to prove that it meant whatever to me. And I have to remind myself even now, because that is a deeply embedded pattern in my grief process. We can learn how to do these things differently, but it really takes practice. It takes attention. It takes awareness. You've just heard some of the material that I'll be going into at the workshop that I'm doing 2 weeks from yesterday. So Friday, the 5th of March. It's a 2.5-hour workshop, and I really invite you to come and join us as we go through it. There'll be more head information, but most importantly, there will be experiential time in this workshop. I have done this specific workshop, probably 6 or 7 times. I actually did it here for Crystal Coast Unity a year ago, November-ish. And I've never been, I've never come away not amazed by the incredible trust that people have for each other to share important information, by the healing that can occur in what is really a very short amount of time. And I think that it's well worth your time, and I invite you to join us for that. There, I will talk a little bit more about what we can do for ourselves when we're grieving, whether it's big or small, or somewhere in between. We can allow our emotions, obviously. We can feel our sadness and our hurt. We can remember to breathe. It is amazing what breathing does for us. We can express physically, whether that's taking a walk, whether that's beating up a pillow, whether that's singing at the top of our lungs to a happy or a sad song. We can take care of ourselves physically, whether that's with moderate physical exercise, whether that's with sleep, whether that's with eating appropriately, whether that's coming to church in order to receive the life-affirming hugs and care and compassion that is available in this faith community and probably in other places in your life. We can talk to someone who will listen compassionately, not try and fix it, but just simply listen to the story until we don't need to tell it anymore. And we can do that same thing for friends and family and loved ones when they're in the throes of a grief process. We can recognize that every loss is a unique loss, and it's not at all unusual for the same person to grieve different losses differently. That's very normal. We can know that some people cry and some people don't, that some people talk and some people don't, and that the absence or presence of any of these things is not denial, is not bargaining, is not whatever we would like to label it. It is their process. So I'd like to issue a couple of invitations for the upcoming week. I'd like you to notice if you have a small loss in a change that's coming up, or in a change that you're experiencing right now. And these changes can be changes that we have invited into our lives. Still, inviting a change into your life doesn't mean that you aren't going to notice that there's a loss as a part of it. And in that way, we can honor the small life losses, and we can build our muscles for the bigger things. And the third thing that I'd like to offer is to specifically invite healing around changes and losses. Co-create that with God in your life. Because sometimes we invite change, and sometimes it blows into our lives without any warning at all. The choice that we have always is to notice it's there, to feel the feelings, and notice our reactions and choose our responses. Moment by moment, day by day, we can feel our feelings and allow them to empower us. Like Catherine, I love quotes. And so I'm going to close this talk with a quote from Mark Nepo. He writes in the Book of Awakening, "We often move away from pain, which is helpful only before being hurt. Once in pain, it seems the only way out is through. Like someone falling off a boat, struggling to stay above the water only makes things worse. We must accept we are there and settle enough so that we can be carried by the deep. The willingness to do this is the genesis of faith, the giving over to currents larger than us. even fallen leaves float in lakes, demonstrating how surrender can hold us up. We can learn from the leaves that ducks swim around, in life as in water. When we curl up or flail, we sink. When we spread and do still, we are carried by the largest sea of all, the sea of grace that flows steadily beneath the turmoil of events. And just as fish can't see the ocean they live in, we can't quite see the spirit that sustains us. Again and again, the onset of pain makes us clutch and sink. But life has taught me that how we first open after doubling over is crucial to whether we will heal at all. Blessings.